Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is giving his first interviews since the news broke about its handling of data from millions of users. A reporter he spoke with is here. I'm Elaine Quijano, and this is Red and Blue. Ahead on the program, Mark Zuckerberg responds to questions about why Facebook waited until now to suspend its relationship with Cambridge Analytica. And later, Rick Saccone concedes to Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania's special election, why the Democratic win matters and why it doesn't. But first, CBS News contributor and Wired editor-in-chief Nick Thompson is here. Earlier on Wednesday, he got one of the only interviews with Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg since the social media giant suspended Cambridge Analytica. We'll speak with Nick in a moment. In a Facebook post on Wednesday, Zuckerberg said that his company breached the trust of its users and said, quote, "We also made mistakes. There's more to do, and we need to step up and do it." It's been more than 2 days since news broke that Cambridge Analytica shared Facebook user data with the Trump campaign in a potential violation of the site's privacy standards. On Wednesday night, Facebook was named in a class action lawsuit that accuses the company of violating its users' privacy rights. So Mark Zuckerberg faces plenty of questions about his company, its connection to Cambridge Analytica, and its path forward as a social network of more than 2 billion users. And Nick Thompson got to ask at least some of them. His interview with Zuckerberg is now live on Wired.com. And Nick, this is a fast-moving story, an amazing thing to behold here as we watch sort of this discovery of what was taking place, sort of a peek behind the curtain. So you asked Mark Zuckerberg about why Facebook did not dig deeper to see if Cambridge Analytica had misused the data that they had pledged to delete. He told you, quote, "Cambridge Analytica had actually told us that they actually hadn't received raw Facebook data at all. It was some kind of derivative data, but they had deleted it and weren't in any use of it. In retrospect, though, I think that what you're pointing out here is one of the biggest mistakes that we made." So, Nick, what did you make of why Facebook did not look closer at exactly what Cambridge Analytica was doing?
I think that Facebook has never been great at worst-case scenarios. It's a company that was built on the notion that people do good things and trust each other. And so they got reports that Cambridge Analytica had misused their data. They said, "Hey, Cambridge Analytica, sign this document saying you've destroyed it." They signed the document, and they were probably lying, right? I mean, now that we know a lot about Cambridge Analytica and some of the things they do, you know, you can't trust these people at all.
But Facebook did.
Yeah, Facebook did. Facebook was just built in and for a world that was different from the world in which Cambridge Analytica operates. You can either call it idealism, you can call it naivete. Certainly they misread the situation. What they should have done in 2015, when they learned what Cambridge Analytica had done, they should have audited, and they should have pushed, and they should have gotten every computer that Cambridge Analytica had, which was their right, and they should have searched them.
Well, Zuckerberg also told you that Facebook had taken actions to prevent this kind of breach 3 or 4 years ago, but it was still too late. What was the philosophical change that Facebook went through to put privacy first? And, I mean, are we seeing that now? How are we seeing that?
Yeah, so what happened was up until 2015, if you built an app, you could pull the data of the friends of the users who went into your app. And that's weird. And that's how Cambridge Analytica...
Because those friends didn't have to give permission.
Right. Yes. So that was like a problem. And so Facebook changed its policies in 2014, but after Cambridge Analytica had started, and they gave everybody a year. So basically they shut the barn door, but they let the horses in the pasture run around for a year and a half. So that was the first problem. The philosophical thing, and it was something that Zuckerberg talked about. And I asked him, like, how has your philosophy changed over the last 4 days? He said, well, there are trade-offs, right? And there's a trade-off between portability and privacy. If your data is totally portable, you can move it from Facebook to another app. You can move it off Facebook. It makes everything kind of easier and simpler, and there's less friction. But it can also be hijacked and taken. If you maximize privacy, portability gets harder, but you're less likely to have a catastrophe like we just had. And so what he said today is, you know, we probably didn't have the balance right, and we're shifting the balance now more towards privacy and away from portability.
Well, Zuckerberg told you he can't say the Russian Internet Research Agency or other Russian operatives didn't get a hold of Facebook data. What did you make of that particular admission?
Well, this was super interesting because to me, the biggest risk for Facebook, one of the things they've got to fear, is the convergence of the Russia story and the IRA story.
Right.
And if it turns out not only that the Russians were on Facebook manipulating us, but the Russians were on Facebook manipulating us with our data. That's a nightmare.
That we unwittingly turned over.
So I asked Zuckerberg, I said, do you know? And he said, look, we don't. We can't. There wasn't a watermark on the data that Cambridge Analytica got. You can't just kind of search all the data in the world looking for like a serial number or something. It's a hard challenge. So he said, they're looking. They're obviously cooperating with investigators. And I think they know the risk. But it's interesting to hear him admit that.
To say it out loud like that.
Yeah.
Well, let's bring in Slate technology writer April Glazer. She's in San Francisco. So, April, is there reason to believe that Facebook could have experienced other data breaches similar to Cambridge Analytica?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's important to remember that this isn't technically a breach, right? Because no security system was penetrated here. You know, this data was actually taken straight through the front door. And because it was taken through the front door, because it was taken through a legitimate app maker that then handed it illegitimately over to a fourth party, there's no reason to believe that other app makers didn't do the same thing. So absolutely, it's totally plausible to think that there is another person or 1,000 other people that took 50 million user profiles and took data from that and handed it over to any kind of data broker or political operative, like in the case of Cambridge Analytica.
So all of this has gotten the attention, of course, of Congress, Nick, and there have been many calls for Mark Zuckerberg to testify. In the wake of this scandal, he told you, quote, "If it is ever the case that I am the most informed person at Facebook in the best position to testify, I will happily do that." He also said he may not be the best qualified at the company to testify. How do you think lawmakers or even the public are going to react to that kind of answer?
Well, I think that you can read that as they're going to have to send him a letter and say it's time to come testify. I think the pressure is mounting for him to come testify. I think he's going to go testify. I think that answer was, I think he probably should have just given a more definitive answer that, like, I am happy to go testify. I will go testify. And
because was he referencing sort of the technical aspects of it? Is that sort of, I'm trying to think of what the reasoning.
What I asked him was, I was like, look, everybody, there's a lot of pressure about people asking you to testify.
Right.
Will you go and testify? You've been asked in a tweet.
Right.
Will you go voluntarily, or will it take a letter, right, or even a subpoena, right? Like I don't know what the subpoena is the most severe.
Right.
Tweet is probably less severe.
I don't know in this day and age, Nick. Who knows? In the court of public opinion, a tweet could be pretty powerful.
I think it's inevitable that he goes and testifies.
Yeah.
I think what was super interesting in his answer there, though, was we also started talking about how government could regulate Facebook. Right? Because there's a whole spectrum, right? There's like simple things you can do, like demand ad transparency, or you can go all the way to Sri Lanka where you just shut the whole thing down, right? Like, and there are different approaches that all kinds of different countries have taken.
Yeah.
And what he said was, well, I'm not sure. I think Germany probably went too far. Certainly, ad transparency is something we're okay with. And then he started talking about AI. Right? And what are the responsibilities once AI can do a lot of what regulators would want you to do? That was maybe the most interesting part of our conversation.
Yeah. Well, April, what do you think? I mean, do you think Mark Zuckerberg needs to go to Capitol Hill to testify?
Well, it's his company, and this happened under his watch, and it's totally legitimate for lawmakers to want to talk to the person who is in charge here, you know, not a lawyer who's going to bob and weave and say the thing that's going to be least destructive for the company, but somebody who actually is in charge and can provide real answers about what they were thinking when it happened and what they're going to do under his leadership to not do it again. If they're calling for him to testify, which they are from both sides of the aisle, we see Republicans and Democrats calling for that now, you know, the pressure's mounting, and we should expect to see him in the hot seat soon.
And Nick, you just mentioned the idea of regulations popping up here in the conversation, right? He's also facing this pressure from Europe as well. Tell us about that.
Well, the pressure in Europe is vaster, it's always been. Like, Europe has been much tougher because they prioritize privacy more, and because the companies were invented in America and they're jealous, right? They don't like them, right? I mean, jealous is the wrong word, but like, or maybe they haven't been bought off by all the political power.
To be fair, there's a history of surveillance in some of these countries that is, you know, I think perhaps contributing to this privacy concern.
But they have been hammering Facebook. They're the ones who are pushing antitrust. So Germany has pushed a very tough regulation that went into effect. And what it says is if somebody flags something as hate speech, the company, if it's obvious, has 1 day to get rid of it. If it's complicated, has 7 days to get rid of it. That's put a huge burden on Facebook and Google and the other large companies. I think it's that have more than 2 million users. Right? It's put a huge burden on it. Probably done a lot to reduce hate speech. But it's also created all kinds of complexities because if I don't like you, I should just say that what you do is hate speech. And then what is the incentive of the tech companies? Just wipe everything away, right? Because you get penalized for not wiping it away. You don't get penalized for wiping too much away. You get penalized less. So it creates weird incentives. And Zuckerberg talked about the German law. And he said, well, you know, it's complicated, right? And maybe it actually would be better for us to have some direction on how to use AI to get rid of hate speech. But these very strict policies may not get you to the solution. Now, clearly, allowing Facebook complete control to self-regulate, maybe not the best policy either.
Well,
so
yeah,
we'll have
I don't
to
know that the
find
Americans
some kind
in
of
Europe
balance.
would stand for that at this point. Now, we want to mention, so in addition to speaking with you, Mark Zuckerberg is also speaking with another news organization, CNN. Let's take a listen to some of what he told that network.
This was a major breach of trust, and I'm really sorry that this happened. We have a basic responsibility to protect people's data, and if we can't do that, then we don't deserve to have the opportunity to serve people. So our responsibility now is to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
All right, so essentially echoing there, April and Nick. April, I'm going to go to you first. What we saw in the Facebook post from Zuckerberg earlier. But what do you think needs to be said now, considering what we have just been talking about and what he himself has conceded a breach of trust?
I mean, he's basically saying what he has to say here, what I would consider almost to the bare minimum. He's saying they're going to audit it, they're going to inform people. They have to say that now, because if it is decided that what happened was indeed a data breach, then that could be in violation of state laws that since they didn't notify people right away when it happened or when they knew that it had happened. So, he's covering his bases here, but, he needs to go way further and actually not just say that they want to do better, but actually lay out their principles. Because to say that we want to do better, to say that they want to have users trust, but not actually say what their principles are behind that, it's a view from nowhere, and we could see the same thing happen again.
So, Nick, it was interesting. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Chris Hughes, who was here promoting a book, and we talked about Facebook. He's one of the co-founders of Facebook, but he basically said, I've been asked a lot with respect to Russian meddling. Could we have ever imagined when we were in that dorm room in Harvard that one day, we'd be talking about the situation like this? And I'm wondering, in your conversation with Mark Zuckerberg, was there ever a sense that there had been some mechanism in place or somebody who, from the inception of the company, maybe thought, what happens if some of this gets in the hands of bad guys and gals?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because he did talk about the dorm room, right? And at the end, I said, I think the last question I asked was, you have to change all these structural things, right? You change the algorithm to prioritize meaningful interactions and add trust, and you've changed the way you look for disinformation, and now you're going to change all your policies for app developers, and in fact, you're going to change your policies on how easy you make it for people to change their privacy settings. So you're doing all that now, shouldn't you have done some of that earlier?
Right.
What do you wish you had done 5 years ago? And he's like, well, it's hard to say, because back when we were in the dorm room, we didn't know. And a lot of these problems are because we grew so quickly. And I didn't want to change that. But the thing he did say is, the trade-off between privacy and portability, right? And over the past, they've prioritized portability, and now they're going to more prioritize privacy, which I think is a useful change and an interesting philosophical thing to get to. I also think, in his post this afternoon, he laid out a bunch of changes, right? We're going to audit everybody who looks like they have suspicious use of data in 2014, back when the barn door was open, right? We're going to let people change their privacy settings. They're going to lock down the amount of information that developers get, a bunch of good changes. But what he implied in our interview today is there's a list, right? There's there are 100 things you can do, right? And they're here are 4 that you should really do, make your privacy settings clearer. The next 96, they're more complicated trade-offs. I think they're going to move down this list as we go through the year.
And do we know how long that's expected to all take?
I have no idea. I'm making that up about the list of 100 things, but I think you are going to see, the way it worked with the newsfeed changes, right? They announced a couple, they sort of rolled out a couple of changes every week. in January of this year, you'll probably see something like that happening with like privacy protection changes. Though they haven't rolled out all the newsfeed stuff, man, it's going to be busy over there at Facebook. There's a lot for April and me to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's take a listen to some more of that interview with CNN.
We're going to go now and investigate every app that has access to a large amount of information from before we lock down our platform. And if we detect any suspicious activity, we're going to do a full forensic audit.
Facebook has asked us to share our data, to share our lives on this platform, and has wanted us to be transparent. And people don't feel like they've received that same amount of transparency. They're wondering what's happening to their data. Can they trust Facebook?
Yeah, so one of the most important things that I think we need to do here is make sure that we tell everyone whose data was affected by one of these rogue apps, right? And we're going to do that. We're going to build a tool where anyone can go and see if their data was a part of this.
But so the 50 million people that were impacted, they will be able to tell if they were impacted by this?
Yeah, we're going to be even conservative on that. So, you know, we might not have all of the data in our system today. So anyone whose data might have been affected by this, we're gonna make sure that we tell. And going forward, when we identify apps that are similarly doing sketchy things, we're going to make sure that we tell people then too, right? That's definitely something that, you know, looking back on this, you know, I regret that we didn't do at the time, and I think we got that wrong, and we're committed to getting that right going forward.
So April, I mean, this is what Nick was just talking about here. What do you think of that?
You know, it's difficult to say that they're going to do an audit and they're going to track and see where the data went. You know, we have to think of data like toxic ooze that you can't clean up, right? And it's not just that. Like, once it's out there, you can just press a button and replicate it again and again and again. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he's saying that he's trying to cultivate trust here, but Facebook is one of the most profitable companies in the world, and they've become profitable from that data that they've handled irresponsibly. And we have to remember that it was just November of last year when ProPublica did an investigation and found that they were actually letting advertisers target people and send ads to people based on bigoted search terms or based on the bigoted interests, like Jew hater, for example. Like, they could actually buy an ad that would go to people that were interested in that topic, and that's just a terrible, irresponsible way to use this data to target us, to send us ads. And so it's very hard to trust the company now, and it's also very hard to know exactly how they're going to figure out where all this data went in the long run.
So, I mean, Nick, really, the bottom line, isn't there a larger question here about not just Facebook, but, you know, the ubiquitous nature of social media now? I imagine that companies perhaps are obviously watching this very closely and examining their own privacy standards right now. It's because the pressure that is being focused, this sort of spotlight, this very hot spotlight now being focused on Facebook, I imagine, is perhaps sending, or I would think would send some waves of fear and concern down the spines of some other social media company executives.
Well, it probably sends some fear, but they're also sitting there, you know, drinking beer with their feet up, right? I mean, they're competitors with Facebook, right?
There's a little Schadenfreude.
But I think that there are a couple things here, right? So there is a huge spotlight on Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley clearly has more pressure than they've ever felt before. Everybody in Silicon Valley, everybody who runs a tech company is thinking about that. Particularly everybody who ran a tech company that had anything to do with the election of Donald Trump, because they know they're just going to keep getting clobbered because related to that. So that's a big issue. Then there's the issue of privacy. Silicon Valley really hasn't taken that seriously or has not taken nearly as seriously as many people would like them to do over time. They're going to think a lot about that. And then they also have to start thinking about scenario planning, right? This is the fundamental thing we talked about in the first question. They built these things assuming that people would be good, right? People aren't good, right? Like, they probably could have learned that in, I don't know, religious class or history textbooks, but that's where we are. So now you built this thing, and it's built on the assumption that people will use it for nice things with each other. Now you have to think, oh man, now they're using it for terrible things against each other. So how do I change it? How do I adjust it? What do we do in the future? So that's like the triple moment of reckoning in Silicon Valley.
And April, I mean, we should remind people here, Facebook is also behind Instagram and WhatsApp.
That's right. And I think it's also remember to consider how important Facebook is for people, like the centrality of Facebook in people's lives. It's how people connect with family that they don't live near, or friends, or know what's going on, or find events, or to even find the news. It's a central way that many people find the news, and it's hard to just leave it. It's not like with television or radio where you can just change the channel if you don't like the ads you see. You can't just change Facebook because there's nowhere else to go where people are. And I think another important thing to remember here is that Facebook is trying very hard here to avoid government regulation. You know, Nick brought up privacy. There is not a comprehensive digital online privacy law in the United States right now. The one that we have kind of governing email is about 30 years old. Right. And you know, that's going to be a conversation that's probably going to be refreshed and on the table this year. What would federal regulation look like over a company like Facebook,